have in front of me here is the Strongbox by Behemoth Drivetrain. This is a gear reduction unit that bolts onto the front of a transfer case. In this particular instance, we're using a Ford NP205 and the NV271 or 273 gear set for the ring gear and those components. So I'm going to go over some of the components that are required to build this and also what Behemoth gives you as the Strongbox kit. If you're not going to buy these components from Behemoth, they do sell them, but these are sourced from a transfer case that you might find at a salvage yard. You've got a ring gear. This presses into the front section of the Strongbox, and you've got your planetaries with the input shaft as part of that, and then your range selector slider gear, which is going to go in that and is splined for your input shaft. You'll also need to save the input bearing from that donor transfer case, as well as the snap ring for installing into the Strongbox. So this replaces the original input shaft and gear from the NP205. This comes with the Strongbox kit. It adds a splined input to the transfer case that goes directly into the Strongbox. So that is what allows it to be the Shorty kit, which bolts directly to this without the need for any kind of coupling and spacer that would go on there. So your Strongbox kit is comprised of a few key components. The front housing, which you're going to press that ring gear into, as well as your input bearing. And then the back half of the housing, which has your selector, which drives the slide gear. And this is what bolts directly onto the NP205. Now this is an updated design which includes a seal built into it around the mating surfaces of these two halves. If you have an older kit, it would just require a RTV silicone for that. Behemoth also includes the hardware that is necessary to bolt this all together and connect it to your transfer case, as well as a new seal. The first step in assembling the Strongbox is to install the ring gear into the front housing by pressing it in. And notice that the ring gear has these splines, which are what actually dig into the aluminum housing here to keep this from spinning. Some ring gears have dogs, which is just a little bit different design for the same purpose. This part of the gear is what needs to be leading in there. That kind of serves as your pilot. So we'll start by setting that in there and take this out to the press. And when we press this together, we want to press on this broader outer surface, not on any of these machine lips here, because that could damage this part of the housing. The next step that we'll take after that will be to press the input shaft bearing into this same housing and then install our snap ring. Now this is an internal snap ring. Some kits, depending on what gear set you're using, may use an external snap ring, in which case it is a slightly different procedure, but the same basic idea. You'll notice that an internal snap ring has these small grooves kind of at the edge and a larger gap here than an external would. You can turn an external snap ring into an internal snap ring by cutting about an inch off of that so you have that gap, and then grinding the edges just at a little bit of an angle and smoothing that up. And we just want to double check this again, make sure that this surface is smooth, no obtrusions, no big pieces of dirt or chunks of metal that might stop that from seating. That's your pilot side, we want that down. Make sure it's nice and flat as we start to press. And I am pressing off of the broadest surface underneath here using the deepest V side of my press plates. Feels pretty good. So for pressing in the bearing, we want to press off of this surface. The curved part of my press plate there matches this arc quite nicely. Line those up. The next step is going to be to install the planetary gears. And we'll do this by setting these like this. Take our gear housing. One thing to note, after installing everything in there, I did clean everything out with brake cleaner and compressed air. Definitely a good idea at this point too, just to turn these gears and make sure that there's no resistance. So the next step is going to be to install the input seal. Put a little bit of oil on this. So next up is the installation of the Strongbox onto the NP205. One thing to point out here, there are 3 holes in the back of this housing, which are for if you're installing it onto a GM NP205 with the figure 8 housing. You're provided with these shorter cap head bolts in that installation, which would go through the shallow area of the housing there, and then there's a different set of holes where you would use those longer bolts to go through to bolt into that figure 8 part of the housing. And any unused holes can be capped with the included hex head plugs. On a standard NP205 rebuild or installation, you're going to have a retainer that goes around this bearing for the input shaft. With the Strongbox, it's taking the place of that, and this has the exact same machined bearing retaining surface as that stock piece would. Slider gear we're going to install into the Strongbox housing, and that's with the long side facing towards the front. And line this notch with our shift rail. That should mesh up with the input shaft. And let's ensure we've got this lined up. It's important to note that there are 2 different length cap head bolts included with the Strongbox, and we want to be using the short ones for this part. 6 of each. So get these all started. One other hole that's unused in this installation is this side port for, depending on the clocking of this on the transfer case you're installing it on, that might be your fill or vent. In this case it's unused, so we want to put some thread sealant on this and install that. Once you have all these snug down, we'll want to go ahead and get our torque wrench out and bolt these all down to 35 foot-pounds. With those bolts all tight, the next step would be to install the planetary gear housing onto the shift housing. One of the beautiful things about the Strongbox design here is this seal that goes inside of here. It's a rubber gasket that can be undone. You can rotate this. You're not breaking a RTV seal like you would on some designs. What you can do is to mock this up with your transmission if it's out of the truck, or take this, put it underneath your truck, just this half, and see how that lines up with how you want it to be clocked. So, but make a mark on this case and get this positioned wherever you want it. Go ahead and install our bolts, and we're going to be torquing those down to 35 foot-pounds just like we did the ones on the other half. Before I go ahead and torque these down, Just going to make sure that I have smooth operation of the shift.